Who are Victoria's most vulnerable citizens that the Treasurer has pledged to protect? Are they not the 40,000 Victorian families who in 2013 would have been eligible?
The Minister for Energy. Minister for Energy.
Are they not the 40,000 Victorian families who in 2013 would have been eligible for the government's means-tested school start bonus that has now been abolished? Abolished because, according to the Premier, his family didn't need it. Mr Speaker, last time I checked, his family isn't even eligible for it. Who are Victoria's most vulnerable citizens that the Treasurer has pledged to protect? Are they not the thousands of Victorian families who receive the Education Maintenance Allowance? That's right. The government's own Department of Education describes the EMA as assistance to low-income families for helping with the costs associated with the education of their children. It would be difficult to have designed a more targeted attack on vulnerable Victorians than this government's decision to discontinue the schools component of the EMA. Those of us on this side of the chamber know better than anybody that education is the great driver of opportunity. When I look into the eyes of the parents of young people who've come from so many different backgrounds and settled in my electorate, I see people who trust that education will be the thing that gives their kids a chance for a better life than they hoped for themselves. Mr Speaker, what were the members of the government's Budget and Expenditure Committee thinking when they decided to cut this funding? These Tories with their mantra of rugged individualism, of people dragging themselves up by their bootstraps, taking money away from the poorest Victorians, trying to get the very education that would give them a fighting chance to achieve their dreams. How dare they, Mr Speaker? Who are Victoria's most vulnerable citizens that the Treasurer has pledged to protect? The TAFE sector has always had a responsibility to provide access for disadvantaged people. But now we learn that TAFE leaders have been told that community service obligations can be discarded as part of the cuts contained in this budget. As Holmes Glen Institute of TAFE Chief Bruce McKenzie said in Today's Age, this is an attack on the most vulnerable people. When it comes to protecting Victoria's most vulnerable citizens, I'll give the Treasurer credit for choosing his words carefully, because when the government decided to slash funding for refugee support, while they may be vulnerable, they're not yet citizens. Mr Speaker, Victoria is not like other states where rednecks question immigration every day. Immigration has been unambiguously good for Victoria. Celebrating our diversity and our multiculturalism crosses the political divide. Surely our most vulnerable migrants are our most recently arrived refugees. This government should be ashamed that it has so significantly reduced support for their health, education and justice needs. One group of vulnerable Victorians who found a voice in the government's budget priorities are the residents of New Street, Brighton.
Oh, indeed.
There it is. There it is, ranked 223rd on the LCAM list. 223rd on the LCAM list. That's right, Mr Speaker, our rail safety experts tell us there are 222 busier or more dangerous crossings throughout Victoria. When the budget priorities were being set, no one can accuse the member for Brighton of being caught napping. Make no mistake about it. Make no mistake about it, Mr Speaker. $2 million has been allocated already, but it will cost tens of millions to grade separate. And we will hold every government member accountable for unfunded crossings higher on the LCAM list in their electorates that they claim there are insufficient funds to fix. This government will wear this outrageous boondoggle like a crown of thorns. The chasm between rhetoric and reality, the chasm between
the Minister for Energy. Cut it out.
The chasm between rhetoric and reality is no wider than in the government's claims about infrastructure. Mr. Speaker, like a bawdy burlesque dancer, the government has taken to teasing Victorians. A hint of a road here, a glimpse of rail there, a peek of a port here, a flash of a tunnel over there. Take the $15 million. You must leave something for the imagination, Mr. Speaker. Take the $15 million. Take the $15 million. The $15 million for the so-called East-West link. Mr. Speaker, this is a ploy, not a plan. It's a tactic, not a tunnel. Industry sources tell me that $15 million buys approximately 15 metres of this $5 to $7 billion project.
You're going to be doubling it.
Mr. Speaker, that'll get you and me from your chair to the front door. Just trust me, I measured it this morning.
People walk together. We're very familiar with that walk, Speaker. The walk of shame.
And this is typical. The then opposition gave a shout-out to all sorts of communities that a myriad of big-ticket projects stood a chance of being funded if this government was elected. The people of Geelong were wooed with the promise to relocate Melbourne's car trade to the Port of Geelong.
They were dudded.
1,000 jobs and $200 million injected into the local economy. The Ports Minister even put on a shindig and issued the obligatory press release marked with the policy-implemented branding iron. And then yesterday, the admission snuck out under the cover of the budget that the government has abandoned this idea. I think the branding iron will be waiting for him next time he visits Geelong. So no car trade. Oh, and by the way, still no Red Bull air race.
Shame.
And in Doncaster and in Rowville, we see the same choreography, the illusion of action, corridors and consultations, workshops and working groups, but no cash and no jobs. So while the government brags of its record infrastructure program, the truth is that the Treasurer has turned off the tap on new capital works. 3/4 of the capital works underway in Victoria over the next year are the result of projects started by the former Labor government. So while the Treasurer wearies Victorians with his contradictory boast of record infrastructure investment, for which we're supposed to be thankful, and unsustainable debt for which Labor is supposed to be blamed, he would do well to remember that Labor's projects represent the last vestige of a Victorian jobs plan. Meanwhile, Victorians wait for the second Geelong hospital. 30,000 kids are forced to wait even longer for the Monash Children's Hospital.
Shame.
The people of Bendigo are still waiting for the additional $81 million for their hospital. The Iron Ear Hospital has received a minuscule $2 million out of a promised $165 million. All solemn promises made by this government in the lead-up to the last election, none of them properly funded, none of them close to being delivered. I'm sure the Premier now hopes that Victorians have forgotten the very first answer he gave in this place after being elected, when he said, "The coalition was elected by the Victorian people with a promise that it would deliver on all of its election commitments." And indeed, that's what we intend to do. In his own words, Mr. Speaker, this was to be a demonstration of his integrity. Mr. Speaker, it was Shirley MacLaine who said, "Never trust a man when he's in love, drunk or running for office." But when our Treasurer makes a promise, let's be frank, he doesn't mess around. Not for him, caveats and qualifications. Let me take us back to before the election. The scene is the parliamentary dining room. The cast, an intrepid reporter from the Australian Financial Review, and our very own Treasurer before his admission to the Witness Protection Program. And the promise. The now Treasurer said, "We're happy to look at savings, but we will not include under any circumstance any reduction to the public service." Mr. Speaker, he went on to say, "So our commitment to the public service is rock solid. No ifs, no buts. no job losses in the public service. So we're clear on that, aren't we? Mr. Speaker, we're crystal clear. But the sceptical interviewer pushed on, and our Treasurer was not going to resort to lily-livered weasel words. He insisted, there will be no job losses in the public service. There will be no job losses in the public service, he repeated. And just to be sure, in case the pesky interviewer had missed it, he finished with, thank you. I just wanted to make sure the point is clear. Mr. Speaker, this was not the cheques in the mail, my diet starts on Monday, or even, I'll call you. This is the now Treasurer of Victoria. And there he was, 12 months later, handing down the mid-year financial update and announcing 3,600 voluntary redundancies from the public service. Promise broken. Mr. Speaker, fetch the branding iron. You would think that having so comprehensively and emphatically broken this promise, he'd have exercised just a modicum of caution as he returned to the scene of the crime. But our Treasurer is nothing if not a slow learner. He promised first that the 3,600 was it. Finito. Done. And secondly, that at least Victorians could be thankful. At least Victorians could take comfort from his promise that there'd be no forced redundancies. So with 2 new promises to break, our Treasurer set feverishly to work. Mr. Speaker, of course Tuesday's budget contained another 600 job cuts. And the humiliating admission from the Treasurer that when voluntary packages are not enough, they will indeed resort to forced redundancies. Three promises emphatically made, 3 promises emphatically broken. Mr. Speaker, unlike the member for Frankston, I'm not often given to quoting scripture. But wasn't it Jesus who said to Peter that before the rooster crows you will betray me 3 times? Our Treasurer was so quick out of the blocks that the poor rooster hadn't even cleared his throat. And he'd managed to break the one promise 3 different ways. As John Ferguson noted in The Australian yesterday, Wells seems to be making a habit of telling big-time fibs. That's right. If Victorians were under any illusion as to the confusion that inhabits the mind of our State Treasurer, then they only had to listen to the nonsense that he proffered yesterday during question time, where in the one answer he attacked Labor's so-called structural deficit but boasted of his own wafer-thin surplus, itself, on his definition, a structural deficit. Mr. Speaker, if I can finish where I started, with the priceless words of Groucho Marx. He might look like an idiot and talk like an idiot, but don't let that fool you. He really is an idiot. Mr. Speaker, this is a budget that fails Victorians. It fails Victorians desperate for a job. It fails our most vulnerable. It fails to keep promises solemnly made. It fails to provide leadership. It fails to live up to our state's historic promise that each generation passes to the next a belief that our state can lead the nation. No jobs, no heart, no vision, no hope.